Hey guys, tonight we are going back, way back, to a world without running water, without painkillers, without the ability to just quit your job and move somewhere nicer. Tonight you are a medieval peasant, and before you get too cozy with that idea, let me paint you a little picture. Imagine waking up before sunrise, not because your alarm went off, but because the roosters outside your paper-thin wall have decided that 4 a.m. is, philosophically speaking, morning. Your bed is a straw pallet that smells faintly of mildew and something you'd rather not identify. Your back already hurts. It will hurt for the rest of your life. Outside, the field is waiting. It is always waiting. And somewhere in the distance, your lord's manor sits on the hill, patient as a tax collector, which is essentially what it is. You probably won't survive this, not comfortably anyway. But that's what we're here for. To walk through it together, slowly, so you can drift off to sleep feeling deeply, profoundly grateful for your mattress. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I genuinely love seeing those. Someone's always watching from somewhere unexpected at 2 in the morning, and honestly, same. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are, for the purposes of this story, a peasant in medieval England, let's say somewhere around the 12th or 13th century, which historians tend to agree was the high water mark of the medieval period, right before everything started going catastrophically wrong in the 14th. You live in a village. That sentence sounds simple, and it is, but the implications of it are so total, so all-encompassing, that it's worth sitting with for a moment. You don't just happen to live in a village the way you happen to live in your current neighborhood, something you could theoretically leave if you saved up enough or got a better job offer. You live in this village the way a tree lives in a particular patch of soil. You are, in a very real legal and economic sense, part of the land itself. The village is small. We're talking perhaps 30 to 60 households clustered together in a settlement that probably doesn't have a name anyone outside a 10-mile radius would recognize. There's a church, always a church, and we'll get to that later at considerable, slightly horrifying length, a mill, a blacksmith if you're lucky, a handful of communal buildings, and then fields. So many fields. The fields are not yours, but you will spend the majority of your waking life in them, which is its own particular kind of cosmic joke. The system you're living inside is called the manorial system, and it is one of the most elegantly suffocating pieces of social engineering ever devised by people who definitely had your best interests absolutely not at heart. At the top of your immediate world sits the lord of the manor, a knight or minor noble who technically owns the land, the mill, the fish pond, the woodland, and in some meaningful legal senses, you. Below him is a hierarchy that includes freemen, villains, serfs, and various gradations of unfreedom that medieval legal scholars spent an impressive amount of time arguing about, probably because they were not the ones out in the mud. You, in our story, are a villain. This is not a moral judgment. The word won't acquire its sinister modern spelling for a few more centuries, but it is a legal status that means you are bound to this manor. You cannot leave without your lord's permission. You cannot marry without your lord's permission. If you somehow manage to save enough money to buy a plot of land somewhere else, that would also require your lord's permission, and he would almost certainly say no, because why would he let a productive pair of hands walk off his estate? You are not enslaved in the way that word is used historically, but you are not free in any way that a modern person would recognize as freedom. Historians still argue about exactly where on the spectrum between serfdom and free tenancy the average English villain actually sat, and the answer seems to be uncomfortably in the middle, with most of the discomfort falling on the villain. The land around your village is divided according to the open field system, which is a communal agricultural arrangement that sounds almost admirably cooperative until you realize how little control you have over it. Typically, the arable land is split into 2 or 3 enormous fields. Actual open expanses without fences or hedges, just long, narrow strips of cultivated earth running side by side. You hold a collection of these strips, scattered across the fields in a patchwork arrangement, and the strips you hold are not chosen by you, are not adjacent to each other, and were not selected with any particular regard for your convenience. They are yours to work, but not yours to own. The distinction is important and deeply tiresome. The reason your strips are scattered rather than consolidated into one manageable block is partly historical accident and partly a system designed to spread out the good and bad soil equitably. Which sounds fair and might even be fair, in the sense that everyone gets a little of the good stuff and a little of the terrible waterlogged corner by the stream. But it also means that farming efficiently is essentially impossible, because you spend a meaningful portion of your working life simply walking between your strips. A historian looking at medieval field records once calculated that a peasant farmer could hold strips totaling perhaps 30 acres but have them spread across dozens of locations. You are, in effect, commuting, without the commute ever ending. The communal nature of the open field system means that you do not decide what to grow, when to plant, or when to harvest. Those decisions are made collectively, by the village community acting together, usually in the form of a manorial court or through long-established custom. If the village has decided this field grows winter wheat this year, it grows winter wheat. If the village rotates the southern field to fallow, left unplanted to recover, your strips in that field are fallowed whether you like it or not. There's something almost meditative about it, this enforced collective rhythm, until you remember that you're also hungry and that the decision about your land was made by a committee you had limited input in, ratifying customs that predate your grandfather. One of the quirkier aspects of this communal land arrangement, and one that often surprises people, is the practice of common rights. The uncultivated land around the village, the commons, the waste, the woodland margins, is not owned by any individual peasant, but can be used by all of them according to defined rights. You have the right to graze a certain number of animals on the common. You have the right to gather a certain amount of wood. You might have the right to cut peat for fuel, or to fish in the village pond, or to collect fallen acorns for your pigs. These rights are not generous gifts from a benevolent lord. They are hard-won, fiercely defended entitlements that your community will go to considerable lengths to protect. The commons are, in a real sense, the difference between bare survival and complete destitution, and the people living on them know it. Your house sits at the edge of the village street, if the rutted track that runs through your settlement can be dignified with that name. Behind it is your toft, the enclosed plot of land immediately around your dwelling, and beyond that your croft, a small enclosed garden where you grow vegetables, keep a few chickens, and maintain the illusion of having some private space in an otherwise entirely communal existence. The toft and croft are yours in a more personal sense than the open field strips. They are where you grow the onions and the leeks and the cabbages that supplement your diet. They are where the children play when they're not helping in the fields, which, to be honest, is not that often. Children in a medieval village are a labor resource before they are anything else, and by the time a child is 6 or 7, they are already contributing. Scaring birds off the crops, gathering firewood, watching the livestock. Speaking of livestock, you probably have a few. An ox, if you are reasonably prosperous, or more likely a share of an ox held collectively with your neighbors, because oxen are expensive and a full plow team of 8 oxen represents a kind of collective wealth that no single villain household would typically command. You might have a cow, a few sheep, some pigs, chickens. The animals are not pets. The animals are food security, labor, fertilizer, and in the case of the ox, the entire basis of your agricultural operation. When your ox dies, and it will die at exactly the worst possible moment, this is not a sad day. It is a crisis. The rhythm of your year is set entirely by the agricultural calendar, which is itself set by the physical demands of the land and the religious calendar of the church, which overlay each other so completely that it's essentially impossible to say where one ends and the other begins. Plowing in autumn, planting winter wheat, then spring plowing, planting oats and barley and peas, then summer haymaking, then the desperate communal effort of harvest in late summer and early autumn, then preparation for winter, then doing it all again. There is no off-season in the way modern people understand that phrase. There is simply a different kind of work. Harvest is the hinge point of your entire year. Everything, your food supply for the coming winter, your ability to pay your rents and dues, your family's survival, depends on what comes out of the ground in those few frantic weeks in August and September. The whole village mobilizes. Men, women, children, the elderly who can still hold a sickle. Everyone is in the fields from first light to last, cutting, binding, stacking, carting. You work through muscle pain and sunburn and the particular exhausted delirium that sets in around the 4th consecutive 14-hour day. If the weather holds and the harvest is good, there is a collective exhale, a communal feast, something approaching joy. If it doesn't, if the rain comes early or the grain develops rust or an early frost hits, then you are looking at a winter that ranges from difficult to potentially fatal. We'll come back to famine in a later stretch of tonight's story, because it deserves its own slow, grim examination. For now, though, let's stay in the village as the sun goes down on your first imagined day in this world. You have walked. Estimates suggest the average peasant farmer walked between 6 and 8 miles during a typical working day, just moving between tasks and strips. Your feet are bare or wrapped in simple leather shoes that do not, by any stretch of the imagination, provide arch support. Your hands are cracked and calloused in ways that a modern hand lotion advertisement would treat as a personal tragedy. You are hungry, but not yet desperate. Tonight there is pottage, a thick stew of whatever vegetables came out of the croft, and maybe a heel of dark bread. You eat it quickly because it is dark, and candles are expensive, and you need to be up again when the rooster decides morning has arrived. And somewhere on the hill above you, the manor house glows with firelight through its actual glass windows, and your lord is having his supper, and tomorrow he will need your labor again, and you will give it because that is the arrangement. And the arrangement is older than memory and enforced by custom and law and the quiet, constant threat of everything it means to have nowhere else to go. This is your village. You are stuck in it. But at least, for tonight, you know what you're stuck in. The lord of the manor is not, technically speaking, a villain. He has a role to play in the medieval social order, a set of obligations running upward to his own lord and downward to you, and if you asked a medieval theologian to explain it, he would describe a beautifully balanced system in which each person contributes according to their station and receives according to their need. The theologian would say this with a straight face. He would probably be quite well-fed. You, standing in the mud outside your toft with your cracked hands and your perpetually aching lower back, might have some follow-up questions. Because here is the reality of life at the bottom of the medieval feudal pyramid. Almost everyone above you has a legal, customary, or spiritual claim on some portion of what you produce, and the cumulative weight of all those claims is genuinely staggering. It is not one person taking your stuff. It is a whole architecture of obligation, built up over generations, encoded in law and custom and the very language of the church, designed, whether intentionally or not, to ensure that the people doing the hardest physical work in medieval society retain just enough to keep doing it. Let's start with the most immediate and visible drain on your resources. The obligations you owe directly to your lord. As a villain, you owe him labor. This is called week work, and it means that for a set number of days each week, typically 2 or 3, though it varies considerably by manor and by the terms of your specific tenure, you are required to work on your lord's land, his domain, rather than your own strips. You don't get paid for this. It is simply what you owe. You show up with your tools, you plow his fields, you harvest his crops, you repair his fences, you do whatever the reeve, the lord's local manager, often himself a peasant elevated to a deeply awkward middle position, tells you to do. Week work alone would be manageable in the grim, medieval sense of the word. But week work is just the baseline. On top of it come the boon works. Additional days of labor required during especially busy agricultural periods, particularly at harvest time, when your lord needs every available hand to get his grain in before the weather turns. You are required to drop whatever you are doing on your own strips, even if your own harvest is equally urgent, even if your own grain is equally at risk from the incoming clouds on the horizon, and work for him first. The Lord's harvest comes before yours. That's the deal. Historians still argue about whether the practical application of this rule was as harsh as the written records suggest, or whether local customs softened the edges in ways that didn't make it into the formal documents, but the formal documents are not encouraging reading. Then there are the financial obligations. Chief among these is the rent, not paid in money necessarily, since the medieval economy runs largely on goods and services rather than coin, but owed in some combination of cash, produce, and labor. You might owe your lord a portion of your grain harvest, a number of eggs at Easter, a hen at Christmas, a specific quantity of ale or cheese. These renders, as they're called, are not suggestions. They are recorded in the manorial rolls, the administrative records kept by the lord's officials, and they are expected with a regularity that makes your modern phone bill look casual. Beyond rent, there are the incidents of tenure, a delightful legal phrase for a collection of additional payments triggered by specific life events. When you die, your lord is entitled to your best beast as a Harriet, essentially an inheritance tax paid in livestock. Your family has just lost its patriarch or matriarch, its primary agricultural worker, and before they can fully process that grief, the reeve shows up to take the best ox or the best cow. This is not a metaphor for anything. This literally happens. When your child wants to marry, you owe your lord a payment called merchet, permission to marry, which in the case of a daughter marrying off the manor is especially significant, since it represents a loss of labor and future labor. When your son wants to go to school, a rare but not impossible aspiration even for peasant families, you owe a payment for that too. Education, marriage, death, all monetized, all flowing upward. If you want to use the Lord's mill, and you do want to use the Lord's mill because grinding your own grain without it is backbreaking work and also technically not allowed, you pay a multure, a toll taken as a portion of the flour produced. The mill is a monopoly, and like all monopolies, it is not shy about this. The Lord also typically controls the oven where bread is baked, the press where grapes or apples are turned into wine or cider, the fish pond, the hunting grounds. Access to all of these comes with a fee, a toll, a portion, a render. Your lord has, in effect, placed a small tax booth at every productive activity available to you, and staffed it with custom and law rather than an actual person, which somehow makes it worse. Now layer onto all of this the obligations you owe not to your lord but to the church. The tithe is the most famous and most comprehensive. 1/10 of everything you produce, owed to the parish church. 1/10 of your grain. 1/10 of your vegetables. 1/10 of the lambs born in your flock. 1/10 of the piglets. 1/10 of the eggs your chickens produce. Medieval tithe collectors were not working from an honor system. They counted. They showed up at shearing time and took every 10th fleece. They appeared at harvest and watched the threshing floor with an accountant's eye. The tithe was, by the 13th century, enforced not just by custom but by canon law, backed by the threat of excommunication, which in a world where your eternal soul's destination was a matter of absolute, terrifying reality, was not a trivial threat. On top of the tithe, the church collected burial fees, baptism fees, and fees for various other sacraments. There were offerings expected at major religious festivals. There were collections for the upkeep of the church building, for candles, for the priest's own maintenance. The church also operated a system of penances that could involve financial payment, giving to the poor, funding masses, contributing to church projects, as a means of addressing sin. Salvation itself had a financial dimension, and that dimension consistently ran upward rather than downward. Beyond your lord and your church, there is also the king. Royal taxation in the medieval period was inconsistent but occasionally catastrophic. Tallage, a tax levied on villains by their lords partly at royal instigation, could be demanded at the lord's discretion. Another payment, arbitrary in timing, unavoidable in practice. When the king needed to fund a war, and medieval kings were remarkably enthusiastic about needing to fund wars, the financial pressure cascaded down the social hierarchy with impressive speed and very little mercy. The Crusades, in particular, generated enormous demands for taxation that fell disproportionately on those least able to pay, which is to say, you. There is also the question of market access. If you want to sell anything, the small surplus of grain from a good year, the cheese your wife has made, the wool from your sheep, you must typically do so at the Lord's market, paying a toll for the privilege. If the nearest town has a market that offers better prices, getting there requires permission, travel time you can barely afford, and the constant risk of being identified as a runaway villain if you stay too long. The medieval economy does have market towns, and they do have a certain chaotic vitality that we'll brush past for now, but for the peasant at the bottom, accessing them is complicated in ways that make Amazon Prime look like a genuine miracle of human civilization. Here is a quirky detail that tends to surprise people. In some manners, the Lord had the right to demand that a villain accept a loan. Not offer a loan, demand that you take one. This was called forced lending or a compulsory loan, and it was essentially a mechanism by which the Lord could extract interest from you on money you never wanted and had no use for. You borrowed whether you liked it or not, and you paid back more than you received, and this was legal, and there was essentially nothing you could do about it. The medieval financial system contained innovations that would make certain modern payday lenders blush. The person who actually administers all of this, the face of the system at the village level, is the reeve. As mentioned, the reeve is typically a peasant himself, elected or appointed from among the more capable and reliable members of the village community. And his job is to manage the lord's domain, supervise the week work, collect the rents and renders, and generally make sure the manorial system runs smoothly. It is, by any objective measure, a terrible job. He is responsible to the lord for the efficiency of the estate, which means pressing his neighbors to fulfill their obligations. He is also a member of the community he's pressing, which means he has to live next door to the people he's just forced to give up their best ox for a Harriet. The reeve typically receives some compensation, reduced rents, a small salary, certain perquisites, but he is also personally liable if the accounts don't balance. Medieval middle management had its own particular hell. The manorial court is where all of this is formally administered and enforced. It meets regularly, perhaps every 3 weeks on a large, active manor, and it handles an enormous range of business. Registering land transfers, recording births and deaths, adjudicating disputes between peasants, enforcing labor obligations, collecting fines. The fines are important. The manorial court was, among other things, a revenue-generating mechanism. You could be fined for failing to attend court. You could be fined for not fulfilling your labor obligations. You could be fined for letting your animals stray into your neighbor's strips, for failing to maintain the boundary markers between plots, for brewing ale without permission, for grazing more animals on the common than you were entitled to. The court records from surviving medieval manors are essentially a catalog of small miseries and small extractions, page after page of names and offenses and fines, a documentary record of a community being squeezed from every direction simultaneously. And yet, and this is one of those things that historians find genuinely interesting and slightly baffling, the system was not without its own internal logic and even occasional protections. The manorial court also defended peasant rights. It recorded your tenure, which gave you a legal basis to claim your strips against encroachment. It resolved disputes in a way that, however imperfect, was at least a process. Custom, the long-established practices of the manor, protected you in ways that pure power alone would not have done. A lord who pushed too hard, who violated custom too flagrantly, risked not just peasant resentment but a kind of legal pushback. Villains did take lords to court. They did occasionally win. But mostly, at the end of the accounting, you hand over your grain and your chickens and your best ox and your tithe and your merchet and your Harriet and your mill toll and your market toll, and you receive in return the right to keep working the land, to keep your toft and croft, to graze your animals on the common, and to exist within this system for another year. It is, in the most technical possible sense, a transaction. It is the transaction your grandfather made, and his grandfather before him, and the fact that none of them negotiated the original terms is not, from the Lord's perspective, particularly relevant. You trudge home in the early evening, somewhat lighter than you started the day, in the financial sense. The pottage is on the fire. The children are already asleep on their pallets. Tomorrow the reeve will be by about the late render of eggs, and you'll need to figure out where those are coming from, because the hens have not been cooperative this week, and the hens, unlike the Lord, are at least responding to actual physical conditions rather than a document written before your father was born. You sit by the fire for a moment, the one small luxury that costs nothing, that no one can tax, that is simply warm, and you watch the flame and you do not think about the system you are embedded in because people rarely think about the water they swim in. You think about whether it might rain tomorrow, and whether the barley in the East Strip looks as thin as you feared, and whether the youngest child's cough is getting better or worse. The fire crackles. The night is cold, and somewhere in a ledger in the manor house, your name sits next to a list of obligations that will outlast you. You are hungry, not dramatically, not urgently, not yet, but in that low, persistent background way that medieval peasants are hungry for most of their lives, a kind of nutritional static that hums beneath everything else. It is not the hunger of someone who skipped lunch. It is the hunger of someone whose body has quietly recalibrated its expectations downward over years, whose stomach has learned not to anticipate too much, whose energy levels have settled into a permanent state of mild insufficiency that feels, after enough time, almost normal. Almost. Let's talk about what you actually eat. And let's be honest about it, because the medieval peasant diet is one of those topics that gets romanticized in certain corners of the internet, all artisan bread and foraged mushrooms and wholesome simplicity, in a way that bears almost no relationship to the lived reality of eating the same thing every day, for your entire life in quantities that are never quite enough. The foundation of your diet is grain. Specifically, it is bread and it is pottage, and the difference between a good year and a bad one is largely a question of how much of each you have and how far into winter they last. The bread you eat is not the kind of bread that shows up in a farmer's market with a hand-lettered sign and a $14 price tag. It is dark, dense, coarse, made from rye or maslin, which is a mixture of wheat and rye, or in leaner times from oats or barley or whatever the year's harvest has actually produced. Wheat, the prestige grain, the fine white bread grain, is largely for your betters. You know this, and you have made your peace with it, or rather your peace was made for you by centuries of agricultural economics before you arrived. Pottage is the other pillar. Pottage is, at its most basic, a thick porridge or stew made by boiling grain or legumes, peas, beans, lentils, in water, possibly with vegetables from your croft added in, possibly with a scrap of salt pork if you're lucky and the pig was slaughtered recently and the salted stores haven't run out yet. On a good day, pottage is genuinely nourishing. It has protein from the legumes, carbohydrates from the grain, vitamins from whatever greens you've managed to add. Medieval nutritionists, they didn't exist, but let's imagine them, would grudgingly acknowledge that pottage is not terrible. On a bad day, pottage is thin, gray, and flavored primarily with the memory of better pottage. You eat it anyway because it is what there is. The vegetables growing in your croft represent the most varied part of your diet, and they are doing a lot of heavy lifting. Onions, garlic, leeks, cabbages, turnips, parsnips, peas and beans grown for drying. These are your primary plant foods outside of grain. They go into the pottage. They are sometimes eaten raw. They are preserved where possible through drying or storage in cool cellars, because winter is coming with the absolute predictability of a season that has never once failed to arrive, and the gap between harvest and the following summer is a long, cold stretch of time during which fresh food becomes a distant memory. Herbs you grow yourself or gather from hedgerows add flavor to what would otherwise be an extraordinarily monotonous culinary experience. Medieval cooking, even at the peasant level, made use of a wider range of herbs than people often expect: parsley, mint, sage, thyme, marjoram, both for flavor and for their perceived medicinal properties, since the line between food and medicine in the medieval worldview is blurry at best. A handful of fresh herbs in the pottage is the medieval equivalent of trying to make the office potluck casserole interesting with whatever's in the spice cabinet. Meat is a luxury, but not an impossibility. The pig is your most important meat animal, partly because pigs will eat essentially anything, kitchen scraps, fallen acorns, whatever they can root out of the ground, and partly because a pig can be killed in autumn and salted down to provide meat through the winter in a way that cattle or sheep, with their ongoing utility as draft animals and wool producers, cannot easily be. Pork, bacon, salt pork, these are the meats you know best. Chicken occasionally, when a hen stops laying and her continued existence becomes economically unjustifiable. Eggs, when the hens are laying and before the tithe collector has counted them, are a genuine treat. Sheep are kept primarily for wool and milk rather than meat, which means mutton appears on your table only when an animal is old or sick, not exactly the optimum eating window. Cattle are too valuable as plow animals to slaughter casually. Wild game, deer, boar, the big dramatic animals of medieval romance, are almost entirely off limits to you, because hunting rights are strictly reserved for the nobility and the penalties for poaching are severe enough to make the risk not worth it for a family that cannot afford to lose its breadwinner to a forest court. Rabbits, pigeons, small birds caught in snares, these fall into a grayer legal area and appear occasionally in the peasant diet, more often in some regions than others. Fish is more available than you might expect, partly because the church mandates fasting from meat on Fridays and during Lent and on various feast days, a schedule that works out to something approaching a third of the days in the year, which creates both a religious obligation and a market for fish that the medieval economy duly supplies. Fresh fish is wonderful if you live near water. Salted or dried fish, herring most commonly, is available even inland, and while it is not exactly a culinary adventure, it is protein, and protein is not something you can afford to be snobbish about. The herring trade in medieval Europe was, in fact, one of the most economically significant commercial activities of the period, driven largely by the church's fasting requirements. Your dietary restrictions are someone else's business opportunity. Dairy is a meaningful part of your diet, when the cow or goat is giving milk, which is primarily in spring and summer. Milk itself is drunk, but it is also made into butter and cheese, which can be stored and eaten through the winter. Cheese is, in many ways, the most nutritious thing in your regular diet, concentrated protein and fat in a form that keeps reasonably well. A good hard cheese, made in summer and stored carefully, is a genuine winter asset. You regard it accordingly. What you drink is ale, water, and this is not medieval irrationality but genuine practical wisdom, is unsafe in ways that are invisible to you but absolutely real. Waterborne illness from contaminated sources is a constant background risk in a world without water treatment, and the mild alcohol in ale kills pathogens that would otherwise make you extremely sick. Medieval ale is not the strong, hopped beer of later centuries. It is low alcohol, slightly sour, nutritious in a yeasty sort of way, and consumed in quantities that would alarm a modern health professional but which make complete sense in a world where it's safer than the alternative. Your wife probably brews it, or you buy it from the alewife in the village. Ale is food as much as drink. On the days when the bread is thin, the ale carries some of the nutritional weight. Here is a quirky detail that even enthusiasts of medieval history often overlook. The medieval peasant diet, monotonous and grain-heavy as it was, may have been better for the gut microbiome than the modern Western diet. The high fiber content of coarse whole grain bread and legume-heavy pottage, combined with fermented foods like ale and certain cheeses, created conditions in the digestive system that modern gastroenterologists would find, in some narrow technical sense, enviable. This is not an argument that medieval peasants had it good. This is simply the universe's way of distributing its small ironies. You are miserable, exhausted, politically powerless, and your gut bacteria are thriving. The deeper problem with your diet, beyond the monotony, beyond the dependence on a narrow range of foods, is the fragility of the system that produces it. Your food supply is almost entirely local, entirely dependent on the agricultural output of your village and the surrounding land, and entirely vulnerable to the things that medieval agriculture cannot control. And the thing that medieval agriculture cannot control above all else is the weather. A wet spring delays planting, a dry summer stunts the grain, an early autumn frost hits the harvest before it's in. Flooding ruins the stored root vegetables in the cellar. And because there is no refrigeration, no canning, no supply chain reaching in from somewhere else with emergency provisions, and no government food bank materializing with emergency relief, a bad harvest means hunger. A second consecutive bad harvest means serious hunger. A third means famine, and famine in the medieval period is not a statistic. It is people dying in your village, around you, possibly including people in your household. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 is the most documented and catastrophic example from medieval England and Northern Europe. A series of extraordinarily wet years, caused by climate fluctuations that historians and climatologists are still working to fully explain, destroyed harvests across the continent for multiple consecutive seasons. Grain prices exploded. Animals died of murrain, a catch-all term for livestock disease that thrived in the wet conditions. People ate their seed corn, the grain set aside for next year's planting, which solved the immediate crisis and guaranteed the following years would be worse. People ate horses, then dogs, then things that are not food. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population of Northern Europe died during the Great Famine, though historians still argue about the precise figures and regional variations. You are not living in 1315, we placed you in the somewhat more stable 12th century. But the Great Famine is always out there in your future, a distant storm that your grandchildren will walk into, and the structural vulnerabilities that produce it are already woven into the fabric of your daily life. Even without famine, the late winter and early spring, the hungry gap, sometimes called the starving time, is a reliable annual ordeal. It is the period between when your stored food runs out and when the new season's crops begin to produce. The root vegetables are gone. The grain stores are low or empty. The animals haven't started dropping spring lambs yet. There is very little growing in the croft. You eat smaller portions. You stretch the pottage further. You eat things you wouldn't touch in August, old, sprouting grain, the tough outer leaves of cabbages, whatever can be gathered from the hedgerows. Children get thinner. Old people get sick. And then, eventually, Spring arrives with its nettles and its dandelion greens and its first small signs of plenty, and you eat the nettles with a gratitude that no modern person has ever felt for a vegetable. The sensory experience of your kitchen, if we can call the hearth corner of your single-room dwelling a kitchen, is worth pausing on for a moment. The smell is wood smoke always, because the fire burns all day for heat and cooking, and there is no chimney, just a hole in the roof or a gap in the thatch that lets some of the smoke out and keeps some of it swirling through the room. Your eyes water. Everyone's eyes water. Chronic eye irritation is so universal among medieval peasants that it barely registers as a complaint. The pottage bubbles in its iron pot, if you have an iron pot, which not everyone does. Some households make do with ceramic or even wooden vessels for boiling, using heated stones dropped into the liquid, which is exactly as laborious as it sounds. The bread is baked in the communal oven or, if you're in a village without one this week, in the ashes of your own fire, wrapped in leaves. You sit down to eat, the family around the fire, the smoke threading upward, the ale cup passing between adults, the children getting the thicker, starchier portions because their hunger is louder and more immediate. The bread is dense and filling in the way that very heavy things are filling. The pottage is warm. These are not small things. Warmth and filling are not small things. In a world where cold and hunger are the defaults, you eat with your hands and a spoon, maybe a knife. Forks are not yet a feature of your life, which will please certain people at a certain kind of dinner party who consider them an affectation even now. And when the meal is done and the pot is scraped and the bread is finished down to the last dark crumb, you sit for a while in the firelight, and the hunger is quieter than it was, and that is enough. It has to be enough. Tomorrow the field is waiting, and the field does not negotiate. Your body is a tool. This is not a philosophical statement about the commodification of labor or the dehumanizing effects of feudal agricultural systems, though it is also both of those things. It is a plain physical description of what your body is in practical terms in this life. It is the implement by which everything gets done. Pulls the plow when the ox is unavailable. It swings the scythe through the grain for 12 hours at a stretch. It carries loads that a modern occupational health and safety inspector would document with increasing alarm before eventually sitting down and putting their head in their hands. It bends and lifts and walks and digs, and does all of this in every season, in every weather condition, on the nutritional foundation we just spent considerable time establishing is barely adequate. Your body is a tool, and like all tools used hard and maintained poorly, it is wearing out faster than it should. Let's start with the skeleton, because the skeleton tells the story most clearly. Archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries and medieval England has been extensively excavated because people have been digging things up there for centuries with varying degrees of scientific rigor, shows consistent patterns in peasant skeletal remains that amount to a written record of a life of hard labor. Compression fractures in the vertebrae caused by years of carrying heavy loads. Osteoarthritis in the hips, knees, and shoulders, developing in individuals who were, by modern standards, still relatively young. Muscle attachment points on the bones that are enlarged and rugose, rough and bumpy, because the muscles attached to them were so consistently overworked that the bone itself remodeled to accommodate the stress. Healed fractures in the hands and feet because working with heavy tools and draft animals in muddy conditions is an environment in which things get broken, and medieval fracture treatment is approximately what you'd expect. Your spine, in particular, is having a rough time. The work of medieval peasant agriculture involves an extraordinary amount of bending, weeding, harvesting, digging, tending animals, in positions that modern ergonomists have identified as exactly the kind of sustained flexion that produces disc herniation, nerve compression, and chronic lower back pain. You have lower back pain. You have had lower back pain since you were, realistically, about 25. It is simply there, like the weather, like the hunger, a constant background condition of your physical existence. You have not thought of it as a medical problem because in your world it is not a medical problem. It is just what backs do. Your hands tell a similar story. The palmar calluses on a peasant's hands are thick enough to be essentially their own protective layer, built up by years of gripping hoe handles, scythe handles, plow handles, rope. The skin around the knuckles is permanently cracked from repeated wetting and drying in the fields, from cold water, from contact with soil. Infections enter through those cracks with depressing regularity, because the concept of keeping wounds clean is understood in a vague, herbal, not entirely wrong way. but the germ theory of disease is about 600 years away, and the gap between what people do to treat wounds and what actually works is significant. A small cut on the hand that a modern person treats with soap and a bandage can become, in your world, an infection that tracks up your arm and becomes life-threatening within a week. Dental health deserves its own moment of attention, because medieval teeth are terrible in ways that have both obvious and surprising causes. The obvious cause is the lack of modern dental hygiene: no fluoride, no regular professional cleaning, rudimentary tooth cleaning methods involving twigs and sometimes salt that are better than nothing but not enormously better than nothing. The surprising cause is your diet. Coarse, whole-grain bread is actually less destructive to teeth than refined sugar, which is essentially absent from your diet because it is an expensive import available only to the wealthy. What damages your teeth is the grittiness of your bread. Stone-ground grain contains literal stone particles, and eating it your whole life grinds your enamel down with mechanical efficiency. Medieval dental remains frequently show severe attrition, the teeth worn flat from the top down, like pencil erasers rubbed against a rough surface for years. You also have abscesses, probably at least one. Tooth pain is a persistent feature of medieval life at all social levels, which is one of the few ways in which your experience genuinely overlaps with your lord's. What do you do about all of this physical deterioration? You go to see the person in your community who handles medical matters, who may be the village herbalist, a local wise woman, the parish priest with some medical knowledge, or in rare and serious cases a physician, a learned man trained in academic medicine at a university, whose services are so expensive and so geographically distant as to be essentially theoretical for someone of your station. The herbalist or wise woman is actually your most practical option, and she is not without genuine skill. Medieval herbal medicine contains a significant number of treatments that work, at least partially, because they draw on centuries of accumulated empirical observation about plant properties. Willow bark for pain and fever, which contains salicin, the precursor to aspirin, was used. Honey was used on wounds, and honey is genuinely antimicrobial. Certain molds were applied to infected wounds, and while no one knew why this sometimes worked, we now know that some molds produce antibiotics. But the theoretical framework within which all of this practice sits is the humoral system, the ancient Greek model of medicine, transmitted through Arabic scholarship and firmly embedded in medieval European medical thinking, which holds that the body is governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health is their proper balance. Disease is their imbalance. Treatment involves restoring balance through diet, herbs, purgatives, emetics, and, most famously, bloodletting. Bloodletting, opening a vein and removing blood, sometimes substantial quantities of it, is performed for a remarkable range of conditions, on the theory that excess blood, or blood that has become corrupt, needs to be removed. For a patient who is already weakened by illness, malnourished, and anemic, removing blood is not helpful. This fact is not available to anyone practicing medicine in your century. Bloodletting is performed with a lancet, a small blade, at specific points on the body determined by astrological charts, because the zodiac governs which body parts are appropriate for treatment on which days, and medieval medicine and medieval astrology are intertwined in ways that make it difficult to explain one without the other. Historians still argue about how universally these astrological prescriptions were actually followed in practice, as opposed to in theory, but the charts exist in enormous numbers and clearly someone was taking them seriously. Your local practitioner probably has a zodiac man, an illustration of a human figure with astrological symbols indicating treatment points, pinned somewhere accessible. It is the medieval equivalent of a medical reference poster, and it is wrong in essentially every particular. Childbirth is the single most dangerous regular event in your life if you are a woman, and even if you are a man, it is a recurring crisis point in your household. Medieval maternal mortality rates are difficult to calculate precisely, the records are incomplete and the definitions inconsistent, but the best estimates suggest that somewhere between 1 and 3% of births resulted in the mother's death, which sounds manageable until you consider that a medieval woman might give birth 6, 8, 10 times over the course of her reproductive years, making the cumulative lifetime risk of dying in childbirth genuinely significant. Infant and child mortality is even higher. Estimates suggest that somewhere between a quarter and a third of children born in medieval England did not survive to age 5. You have almost certainly already lost a child, or you will. This is not a dramatic plot point. It is a statistical reality that shapes the emotional texture of medieval family life in ways that historians debate. Did medieval parents love their children less, knowing they might lose them? The current scholarly consensus leans firmly toward no, that love and grief were fully present, but that people developed psychological frameworks for processing loss that look different from modern grief because they had to. The diseases that shape your world are worth naming because they are not abstract. Dysentery, bloody, debilitating, dehydrating, is a recurring visitor, especially in summer when food and water contamination peaks. Typhoid follows contaminated water with the same reliability as dysentery. Tuberculosis, consumption as it's known, moves through crowded, poorly ventilated communities with patient, devastating efficiency, and your home is both crowded and poorly ventilated. Ergotism, caused by eating grain contaminated with the ergot fungus, produces symptoms that range from convulsions and hallucinations to gangrene of the extremities. The burning sensation it causes in the limbs gave it the name St. Anthony's Fire, and outbreaks periodically struck communities eating contaminated rye without any awareness of what was causing it. Malaria, in its milder forms, was present in medieval England in the fenlands and coastal marshes, contributing to the general burden of fever and weakness. Your life expectancy, if you survive childhood, and that if is doing considerable work, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 years, though this number requires careful interpretation. Medieval life expectancy figures are often quoted in ways that make the Middle Ages sound more uniformly deadly than they were. When you average in the very high infant and child mortality, the mean life expectancy at birth drops dramatically. A person who survived to adulthood, who made it past the dangerous early years, might reasonably expect to live into their 50s or 60s. There are genuinely old people in your village, the grandmother who remembers 2 bad harvests ago, the elderly man who has outlasted 2 wives. Old age exists in the medieval world. It is simply less common, less guaranteed, and more physically brutal than modern old age, because the accumulated damage of a lifetime of hard labor and inadequate medical care is written into every joint by the time you get there. Here is the quirky detail that earns its place in this particular section. Medieval surgeons, and there were surgeons, distinct from physicians, doing practical cutting and setting rather than theoretical humoral management, were sometimes surprisingly effective. Battlefield surgery, driven by the grim practicality of treating large numbers of wounded men quickly, developed techniques for wound management, amputation, and even trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, that archaeological evidence suggests sometimes actually worked, in the sense that patients survived the procedure and the skulls show evidence of healing afterward. A 13th century surgical manual might contain instructions for removing arrows, setting fractures, and treating burns that a modern emergency physician would recognize as directionally correct, even if the antiseptic conditions were approximately 0. Medieval surgery is not good by modern standards, but it is better than its reputation, and the people practicing it were paying close attention to results in ways that occasionally, inadvertently, produce something close to empirical knowledge. None of this, however, is particularly available to you. You are not a knight on a battlefield with a surgeon in attendance. You are a peasant with a bad back and a tooth that has been aching since last winter and a child whose cough is not getting better. And your options are the herbalist, prayer, and time. 2 of these are free. Prayer is free in the monetary sense but carries its own costs, which we will examine at length in a later section. Time is free but not always available in sufficient quantities. What you have in place of medicine is endurance. The capacity to keep going through pain and fatigue and illness that would send a modern person to urgent care is not a moral virtue. It is a survival requirement, so universal in your community that it simply doesn't register as anything remarkable. Everyone hurts. Everyone is tired. Everyone has the cough that comes back every winter, the knee that swells in the cold, the back that locks up during harvest. You compare notes with your neighbors not to seek sympathy but to exchange information, what worked for someone's joint pain, what the herbalist gave for a child's fever, what prayer was recommended for eye trouble. Medical knowledge in your world is communal, practical, and oral, passed between people who are all working with the same inadequate toolkit. And so you get up every morning, the body protesting, the back announcing itself immediately, the hands stiff in the cold, and you do the work because the alternative to doing the work is not rest. The alternative to doing the work is not eating. And not eating, as we have established, is a far worse problem than a bad back. So you stretch in whatever approximate medieval way constitutes stretching, and you pick up your tools, and the field receives you again, patient as ever, indifferent as always. Come inside for a while. You have been in the fields long enough. Your boots, such as they are caked with the particular heavy mud that medieval English fields produce in quantities that seem almost personal, as though the earth itself is trying to slow you down. Come through the low doorway. You have to duck, because the door frame is set at a height that suggests the person who built this house was either shorter than you or simply not thinking about it. And let your eyes adjust to the interior, which is darker than outside even on a bright day, because the windows are small and covered with oiled cloth or thin-scraped animal membrane rather than glass, admitting a dim, diffuse light that is enough to navigate by and not much else. This is your home. Let's spend some time here, because the domestic interior of a medieval peasant's dwelling is one of those subjects that tends to get either romanticized into a kind of rustic coziness or condemned as pure squalor, and the reality is, as usual, more complicated and more interesting than either version. The building itself is probably a longhouse or something close to it. The term longhouse covers a range of structures, but the essential form is a rectangular single-story building, longer than it is wide, constructed from whatever locally available materials your particular corner of England favors. Timber framing with wattle and daub infill in wooded areas, stone in regions where stone is plentiful, cob in the southwest. The roof is thatched with straw or reeds, and it is thick enough to provide reasonable insulation, which is the one genuine architectural virtue of thatch and probably the reason it was used for so long by people who had every reason to prefer something better if something better had been available. The floor is beaten earth, possibly strewn with rushes or straw, which serves the dual purpose of providing a slightly softer surface underfoot and, when changed periodically, absorbing the various liquids that find their way onto a medieval floor, which we will enumerate only partially out of mercy. The interior is one room, not one room plus a bedroom and a bathroom and a kitchen, one room total, in which all of the activities of your family's life take place. Sleeping, eating, cooking, working at indoor crafts, caring for sick family members, sheltering from storms, arguing, making up, being born, occasionally dying. All of this happens in this one room, which is perhaps 30 to 40 feet long and 15 to 20 feet wide if you are reasonably prosperous, and smaller if you are not. There is no hallway. There is no division of space by function in the modern sense. There is a hearth, which is the center of thermal and social gravity, and everything else arranges itself around it. The hearth is set in the middle of the floor, or sometimes along one wall, and it burns wood or peat depending on what's available in your area. There is no chimney, or rather, there is a hole in the roof, a smoke vent or louvre, which allows some of the smoke to escape upward by convection, and allows rain to come in by physics, and which represents the state of the art in medieval domestic ventilation. The smoke does not go neatly up and out. It percolates through the interior, rising slowly, stratifying into a layer above head height that is thick with particulate matter and carbon monoxide and the various byproducts of incomplete combustion. You live your entire life breathing this. Your lungs are, as a consequence, not in ideal condition. The soot coats the underside of the thatch and the interior of the roof structure, which is actually useful. The creosote impregnation makes the thatch more resistant to rot and to insect damage, but it does this usefully disgusting thing at the cost of your respiratory health, which is a trade your house has made without consulting you. Now, and here is the part that tends to produce the strongest reaction in modern audiences. The far end of the longhouse, separated from the human living area by sometimes nothing more than a low partition or a slight step in the floor level, is where the animals sleep. Specifically, in the classic longhouse arrangement common across medieval northern Europe and Britain, the cattle or oxen are housed at one end of the building, with the family at the other. This is not a sign of particularly close emotional attachment to the livestock, though you are certainly fond of them in the way that people are fond of things they depend on entirely. It is a practical arrangement with genuine advantages that any medieval peasant could articulate and any modern person can appreciate once they stop reacting to the initial information. The animals generate heat. A cow at rest produces roughly as much thermal energy as a small space heater, and in a northern European winter, the body heat of 2 or 3 cattle at the end of your house raises the interior temperature of the whole building in ways that are not trivial when the alternative is freezing. The animals also need to be watched and tended through the night. A cow about to calve, an ox that has developed a limp, livestock that might otherwise be vulnerable to theft or predation in an outdoor shelter, and having them in the house means you can tend them without going outside in the dark and the cold. It is, in its own medieval way, efficient. The smell, however, is significant. This is acknowledged even in medieval sources, which is saying something, since medieval sources are generally not written by people with hypersensitive noses and certainly not by people who spent much time in peasant houses. The mixture of animal manure, unwashed human bodies, tallow candle smoke, wood smoke, fermenting ale, damp thatch, and whatever has been cooking in the pot produces an olfactory environment that a modern visitor would find immediately and powerfully overwhelming. You do not find it overwhelming because you have never known anything else, which is one of the small mercies of not having a reference point. The nose adapts. The brain categorizes familiar smells as background. Your home smells exactly like home. The furniture is minimal and functional. There is a trestle table, boards laid over supports that can be dismantled and stacked against the wall when floor space is needed, which it often is. There are stools or benches rather than chairs with backs, because chairs with backs are a luxury associated with people of higher status. There is a chest or two, iron-banded and lockable, which serves as both storage and, in a pinch, additional seating. The chest is where you keep your most important possessions. Documents if you have any, good cloth, anything of value that needs to be protected. There may be a shelf along one wall for the cooking equipment. The iron pot, wooden bowls and spoons, a knife or two, a ceramic jug for the ale. That's approximately the complete list. The beds, and here is something that surprises many people, are probably not the miserable straw pallets on bare earth that popular imagination suggests, or at least not always. Archaeological and documentary evidence suggests that many peasant families slept on wooden bed frames, elevated off the floor with straw or hay mattresses, the mattress ticking being rough linen or wool, and covered with whatever combination of blankets, cloaks, and animal skins they owned. This is not luxurious. The mattress needs to be refreshed periodically because straw compresses and develops inhabitants of the small, itchy, biting variety. The blankets are heavy and scratchy. But sleeping elevated off the cold earth floor under adequate coverings is genuinely warmer and genuinely better than the alternative, and medieval people were not indifferent to the difference between cold and warm when sleeping. Several family members share the bed, which is warm in winter and, in the manner of all situations involving multiple people sharing a single mattress, occasionally complicated in other ways. The question of personal hygiene in the medieval peasant household is one where the popular image is particularly unfair to the actual historical record. Medieval people did not, by and large, consider dirt a virtue or cleanliness a vice. They washed. The frequency and thoroughness of washing was constrained by the practical difficulty of heating water over an open fire in a single large pot. It takes time, it takes fuel, and fuel is a resource with its own cost. But washing hands before eating was standard practice. Washing the face and hands daily was considered normal, and more complete bathing happened regularly if not daily. Public bathhouses existed in medieval towns and were well patronized. The idea that medieval Europeans never bathed is one of those historical myths that refuses to die despite being fairly comprehensively contradicted by the sources, and we can put it quietly to rest here. What medieval hygiene could not address, however, were the things that personal washing doesn't touch. The lice and fleas that lived in the straw of the mattress and the wool of the clothing and the thatch of the roof and essentially every textile surface in the house. Parasites were universal, across all social classes, and the medieval response to them combined practical measures. Combs designed specifically for lice removal, herbal preparations applied to hair and bedding, regular beating of mattresses and airing of blankets, with a kind of resigned acceptance that was neither slovenly nor defeatist but simply realistic. You cannot eliminate lice from a medieval house. You can manage them. You manage them. Here is the quirky detail that earns its place in this section. Medieval peasant houses in some regions of England were occasionally built with a small intentional niche or ledge near the hearth specifically for the family cat, because the cat's primary employment was rodent control, and a warm spot near the fire was understood to be appropriate compensation for services rendered. The domestic cat in medieval Europe occupied a genuinely useful and reasonably well-regarded position in the household economy, a working animal rather than a pet in the modern sentimental sense, but one whose contribution was real and acknowledged. Medieval cats were slightly different from their modern descendants in some behavioral respects, but they were recognizably cats, which means they did what they wanted when they wanted and regarded your gratitude as their due. Some things are continuous across history. The children of your household are everywhere and nowhere. In the house when it's raining, in the yard when it isn't, running tasks between the house and the field, watching the younger ones while you work, being watched themselves by the older ones in a cascade of informal childcare that is the medieval working family's solution to the problem of what to do with small people when every adult is occupied with essential work. Children learn by doing, alongside adults, from an age that would make a modern child welfare advocate reach for their clipboard. A 7-year-old girl in your household knows how to spin wool, tend the fire, mind a younger sibling, and identify which plants in the hedgerow are edible. A 7-year-old boy knows how to scare birds from the crops, lead an ox, and fetch water from the well. This is not exploitation in the Victorian factory sense. It is the transmission of survival knowledge in a world where survival knowledge is non-negotiable. Your wife, and let's spend a moment here, because the labor of medieval peasant women is consistently underestimated and historically underrecorded, works harder than the historical record typically shows. The outdoor agricultural work, the plowing and heavy hauling, is predominantly male, but the gender division in medieval peasant agriculture is less rigid than the formal records suggest. Women worked in the fields during harvest, because at harvest all hands were required. Women managed the dairy, the milking, the butter making, the cheese making, which was skilled, time-consuming work. Women managed the kitchen garden, the croft, the poultry. Women spun wool and flax into thread, wove cloth, made and repaired clothing. Women brewed the ale. Women managed the household economy, which was not a trivial thing to manage. And women did all of this while pregnant or nursing or both, for much of their adult lives. Historians still argue about the relative status of women in medieval peasant communities, whether the economic necessity of female labor translated into genuine social power or remained invisibly subordinate within the household hierarchy. And the honest answer is probably that it varied enormously by individual household, personality, and circumstance. The evenings in your house, after the work is done and the meal is eaten, are not the void that people sometimes imagine. The fire is still burning. You cannot afford to let it go out entirely, because relighting it from scratch with flint and steel is tedious, and the alternative, fetching an ember from a neighbor's house, is a small social transaction that works fine once but becomes tiresome as a regular event. In the firelight, work continues. Spinning, mending, carving small tools or implements from wood. Conversation happens. Stories are told. Not written down stories, but the oral tradition of the village, the legends and cautionary tales and local histories and ribald jokes that circulate through the community and are told slightly differently each time. Because oral tradition is always collaborative and always alive. Sometimes there is music. A pipe, a fiddle, a drum made from a stretched skin. Medieval peasants loved music in ways that the surviving historical record, which is mostly written by clergy who regarded certain kinds of music with deep suspicion, does not fully capture. Songs were sung at work, at festivals, at weddings, at wakes. The musical life of a medieval peasant community was rich and participatory in a way that stands in pleasing contrast to everything else we've discussed tonight. And then the fire dies down, and the room darkens, and the children are already asleep in a pile of small bodies, and the cattle shift and breathe at the far end of the house, and you pull your rough blanket up over your shoulders, and the straw crackles gently beneath you, and the smoke thins as the fire drops, and the cold comes in at the edges of the door, and you are tired, so tired, in every part of your body, and sleep comes fast and heavy and merciful. Your home is small and dark and smoky and cold at the edges and warm in the middle and full of people you love, and tomorrow it will be exactly the same, and somehow that sameness is a kind of comfort, in a world where the alternatives to sameness are almost always worse. The bell is ringing. It is always ringing. The church bell marks the canonical hours, the formal divisions of the medieval day established by monastic tradition and extended, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, to the lay population of every village in Christendom. Matins in the deep dark of early morning, lauds at dawn, prime, terce, sext, none moving through the working day, vespers at evening, compline before sleep. You do not attend all of these offices. You are not a monk, and the abbey's timetable is not your timetable. But the bell shapes your day regardless, marking time in a world without clocks, dividing the hours into liturgical parcels that carry the church's fingerprints on every minute of your existence. You wake to the church's schedule. You sleep to it. You plant and harvest and marry and die within a framework that the church has constructed around you so completely that the framework itself has become invisible, the way the air is invisible, the way the cold is just the cold and not something imposed by anyone. The medieval church is not an institution you interact with occasionally, the way a modern person might attend a service on holidays or in moments of personal crisis. It is the operating system of your world. It is the explanation for why things are the way they are, the framework within which suffering makes sense, the source of your calendar, your law, your education if you have any, your charity if you need it, your community gathering space, and your best available theory of what happens after you die. To say that the church is important in your life would be like saying that gravity is important in your life. It is not a factor among other factors. It is the condition within which all other factors operate. Let's begin with time, since the church owns it. The liturgical calendar is a complete alternative temporal structure overlaid on the agricultural year, and the two systems interweave so thoroughly that separating them is almost impossible. The agricultural rhythm, plowing, planting, harvesting, is anchored to the religious calendar. You plow after Candlemas. You begin spring planting around Lady Day. Harvest aligns with Lammas and the feasts of late summer. Michaelmas in late September marks the end of the agricultural year and the beginning of the new reckoning. The church has not simply blessed the agricultural calendar. It has absorbed it, claimed it, given it saints and feasts and liturgical meaning, so that the turning of the seasons and the turning of the church year are experienced as a single continuous rhythm rather than two separate systems running in parallel. The saints are a crucial and often misunderstood part of this picture. The official theology of the medieval church holds that saints are intercessors, holy people whose closeness to God in heaven allows them to carry petitions upward on your behalf. The practical reality of medieval popular religion is considerably more vivid and immediate than the official theology suggests. Saints, in the lived experience of medieval peasants, are powerful local figures, specific, named, personality-equipped beings who respond to particular kinds of problems, who are associated with particular places, who can be appealed to in emergencies and who will help if properly approached. Saint Apollonia for toothache, Saint Blaise for throat problems, Saint Anthony for finding lost things, an application that has persisted with impressive continuity into the present. Your local parish probably has a dedication to a particular saint whose feast day is a genuine community occasion, whose image stands in the church, and before whom candles are lit and prayers addressed with the directness of someone speaking to a neighbor. The parish church is the center of village social life in ways that extend far beyond the spiritual. It is the largest and most permanent building in your village. This graveyard holds your ancestors and will hold you. It is where legal documents are sometimes read out, where community announcements are made, where the village conducts business that requires a formal, witnessed, sacred setting. Contracts were sworn on its altar. Boundaries were walked on its feast days. The church porch was used for legal proceedings. The church itself, on major feasts, was decorated, filled with candles, smelling of incense. A sensory experience so dramatically different from the smoky, dark interior of your house that stepping into it on a high feast day was a genuine aesthetic event, a deliberate constructed experience of beauty and transcendence that served, among other things, as a very effective advertisement for the institution providing it. The priest who serves your parish is a complicated figure. In the ideal, he is a man of learning and spiritual authority, trained in Latin, able to perform the sacraments, serving as a conduit between his parishioners and the divine. In reality, the parish clergy of medieval England varied enormously in education, competence, and moral conduct. Your village priest may be a genuinely devout and capable man who takes his responsibilities seriously and serves as a genuine community resource. He may also be barely literate, having acquired his position through patronage rather than merit, conducting the Latin Mass by rote without understanding much of it, keeping a housekeeper whose precise relationship to him is understood by everyone and acknowledged by no one. The Church repeatedly attempted to enforce clerical celibacy throughout the medieval period, and the repeated necessity of those attempts tells you something about their success rate. The Mass is conducted in Latin. You do not speak Latin. Neither do most of your neighbors. The theological content of the liturgy is therefore largely inaccessible to you in its textual form, which is one of the more striking features of medieval religious life when you encounter it fresh. An institution that claims the spiritual lives of an entire population conducting its central ritual in a language that population does not understand. What you experience at Mass is not the words but the performance, the movement of the priest at the altar, the elevation of the host at the moment of consecration, the bells rung to mark that moment, the smell of incense, the visual program of the stained glass or wall paintings if your church has them, which translates scriptural and hagiographic narratives into images for a population that cannot read text but can certainly read pictures. Medieval church art is not decoration. It is the primary medium of religious instruction for people who will never encounter a written Bible, and it was designed with that function explicitly in mind. Your engagement with formal theology is therefore primarily visual and ritual rather than textual. But this does not mean your religious life is shallow or passive. Medieval popular religion is extraordinarily active in pilgrimage, in the veneration of relics, in the use of prayers and charms and blessings that blend official church practice with older traditions in ways that the hierarchy sometimes tolerated and sometimes condemned. Pilgrimage was a genuinely popular activity at all social levels, not merely an elite one. The shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury, the most famous pilgrimage destination in England, attracted visitors from every stratum of society, including peasants who saved for years, or walked barefoot as an act of penance, or went because they were sick and had heard of a miraculous cure and had nothing left to lose. The round trip from a village in the English Midlands to Canterbury and back is several hundred miles on foot. People did it. They did it because the boundary between the physical and the spiritual in the medieval worldview is permeable in a way that makes pilgrimage not a metaphor for spiritual seeking but a literal journey to a place where heaven and earth are understood to be especially close. Relics, the physical remains of saints, or objects that touch them, occupy a place in medieval religious culture that tends to make modern people uncomfortable regardless of their religious commitments. A fragment of bone, a piece of cloth, a drop of blood preserved in a reliquary. These are understood in official theology as contact points with the divine, things made holy by association with holiness. In popular practice, they function more like powerful objects, things that carry supernatural charge, that can heal, protect, curse enemies, guarantee safe travel. The relic trade in medieval Europe was enormous, only partially regulated, substantially fraudulent, and deeply sincere all at the same time. There were more fragments of the true cross circulating in medieval Europe than could have been produced by several actual crosses. Historians still argue about the extent to which educated medieval people knew this and simply didn't care, versus the extent to which they genuinely believed in the authenticity of the relics they venerated. Here is the part of the Church's role in your life that is hardest to sit with comfortably: the financial extraction. We touched on the tithe already, the 10% of everything you produce, collected with practiced efficiency. But the Church's financial claims on your life extend beyond the tithe in ways that are easy to underestimate. The sacraments, baptism, confirmation, marriage, last rites, burial, come with expected offerings, fees, and payments that vary by parish and period but are consistently present. You pay to have your child baptized. You pay to get married in the church. You pay for the masses said for your soul after death, and for your family members' souls. And if you can afford it, you pay for chantry masses, ongoing masses said by a dedicated priest, which are a kind of spiritual insurance policy that the very wealthy can afford at scale and the poor can afford in much smaller, cheaper increments. The doctrine of purgatory, the intermediate state between death and heaven where souls are purified before admission to eternal beatitude, is one of the most financially consequential theological developments in medieval religious history. Purgatory, which became increasingly elaborated and formalized through the 12th and 13th centuries, holds that the souls of the faithful dead undergo a process of purification that can be shortened by the prayers of the living and by masses said on their behalf. This means that the spiritual welfare of your dead relatives is an ongoing financial and practical obligation. You pray for the dead. You pay for masses for the dead. You make bequests to the church in your will, and medieval people of all social ranks made wills, even peasants, even people with very little to bequeath, specifically designated to secure prayers for your soul after you are gone. The church has, in effect, monetized the afterlife, which is either a cynical observation or a description of sincere theology depending on your perspective, and the two interpretations are not mutually exclusive. Sin is the other great anxiety engine of medieval religious life, and it too has a formal institutional structure attached to it. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 mandated annual confession for all Christians. At minimum, once a year, every Christian was required to confess their sins to their priest and receive absolution. This sounds, to a modern ear, like a reasonable minimum, but the theological framework around it is considerably more elaborate and anxiety-generating than the bare requirement suggests. Sin was categorized, analyzed, and systematized by medieval theologians into a structure of remarkable complexity. The 7 deadly sins, their subdivisions, the distinction between mortal and venial sin, the penalties attached to each, the precise conditions required for valid confession and absolution. Your priest was supposed to be trained in this system well enough to hear your confession intelligently, assign appropriate penance, and dispense absolution correctly. The penance assigned, prayers to say, fasts to observe, charitable acts to perform, pilgrimages to undertake, was understood as necessary not merely to express sorrow but to satisfy the temporal punishment due to sin even after absolution. The practical consequence of this system for your inner life is difficult to overstate. You live in a world where your thoughts, not just your actions but your interior mental states, are morally significant in ways that require formal acknowledgement and address. Anger harbored against your neighbor, envy of your Lord's firelight and full belly, lust in any of its many officially catalogued forms, pride, sloth, gluttony, avarice. All of these are not just character flaws but spiritual dangers, capable of damaging your soul in ways that require the Church's intervention to repair. The medieval Christian lives, in a real sense, under continuous moral observation, not by a surveillance state but by a theological framework that renders the self permanently visible, permanently accountable, permanently in need of management. The quirkiest and most fascinating piece of medieval religious practice in this vein is the tradition of the Feast of Fools, or similar liturgical inversions, celebrated in some regions around the Feast of the Circumcision in early January. In these celebrations, the normal hierarchy of the Church was briefly, officially inverted. Junior clergy presided over parody masses. Donkeys were brought into the church. The usual solemnity was replaced with deliberate absurdity. Church authorities condemned these practices repeatedly and vigorously, which is how we know they kept happening. The fact that the Church simultaneously produced the most elaborate structure of spiritual anxiety in Western history and also, in some places and times, sponsored a day of official sacred mockery is one of those genuine historical contradictions that makes the medieval Church endlessly interesting and impossible to reduce to a single characterization. And through all of it, the Masses and the confessions, the tithes and the feast days, the pilgrimages and the saints' days and the bells marking every hour of the day and night, runs a thread of genuine belief that is easy to lose sight of when cataloging the institutional machinery. You believe, not in the complicated, qualified, epistemologically self-aware way that a modern person might say they believe in something. You believe the way you believe in the cold, because the cold is simply there and real and has never given you any reason to doubt it. Heaven is real. Hell is real. Purgatory is real. God is watching and Mary is interceding, and the saints are listening, and the fate of your soul is the most consequential fact of your existence. More consequential than the harvest, more consequential than the rent, more consequential than the Lord on his hill and the cold in your bones. The Church is extracting money from you and demanding your labor and making your inner life a source of structured anxiety, and it is also the only framework within which any of this suffering makes any sense at all. You kneel on the cold stone floor of the church, and you say the prayers you know by heart in the Latin you cannot parse, and the candle flame wavers in the draught from the door, and the painted Christ looks down from the chancel arch, and you are small and tired and your back hurts and the rent is due and the harvest was thin this year, and you pray anyway because the praying is all yours, in a life where very little else is. You have done nothing wrong. This is important to establish at the outset, because in the legal world you inhabit, doing nothing wrong is not a particularly reliable defense against having something very wrong happen to you. The medieval legal system is not designed to find the truth in the philosophical sense of that phrase. It is designed to resolve disputes in ways that maintain social order, confirm existing hierarchies, and generate revenue for the people running it, with truth emerging as an occasional and somewhat incidental byproduct of a process primarily organized around other priorities. You are going to encounter this system eventually, everyone does, and when you do, you should know what you are walking into. The first thing to understand is that medieval law is not one system but several overlapping systems operating simultaneously, sometimes cooperatively and sometimes in direct competition, each with its own jurisdiction, its own procedures, its own personnel, and its own particular ways of making your life difficult. There is royal common law, administered through the king's courts and developing steadily through the 12th and 13th centuries into something approaching a coherent national legal system. There is canon law, the law of the church, administered through ecclesiastical courts that handle an enormous range of matters including marriage, inheritance, sexual conduct, and anything touching on the clergy or church property. There is manorial law, administered through the Lord's Court that we visited briefly in Section 2. There are borough courts in towns, forest courts for matters involving the royal forests, and various other specialized jurisdictions that a determined medieval litigant could spend a considerable portion of their life navigating. For you, as a villain, the most immediate and frequent legal encounter is with the manorial court. We have already established that the manorial court is both an administrative and a judicial body. It handles everything from land transfers to petty disputes to the enforcement of labor obligations. What we haven't fully examined is what it means to appear before it as a defendant, which you are quite likely to do at some point, because the manorial court casts a wide net and the fines it generates are a meaningful revenue stream for the lord who runs it. The procedure of the manorial court is based on custom, the long-established practices of the particular manor, which are supposed to be known and respected by everyone, including the lord. In theory, this means you have rights. Custom protects you from arbitrary treatment. If the custom of the manor says that a villain cannot be evicted from their holding without cause, then that protection is real and has been invoked successfully by real peasants in real historical cases. The manorial rolls, the written records of the court, were kept partly because having a written record of custom protected both the lord and the tenants from retrospective revision of the terms. When you hear historians describe medieval peasants as having no legal rights, this is an oversimplification that the actual court records do not support. You have rights. They are just narrow, unevenly enforced, and contingent on the goodwill of a system administered by the very person you might need to use them against. The Lord's steward presides over the manorial court. The steward is the Lord's man, appointed by him, paid by him, accountable to him. The jurors who present cases and render verdicts are your neighbors, which sounds reassuring until you remember that your neighbors are also the Lord's tenants, also subject to his authority, also dependent on his goodwill, and also perfectly aware of which way the wind blows in this particular valley. Jury nullification, the informal refusal of jurors to convict despite evidence, did happen in medieval courts, and it represents one of the few practical protections a peasant community could extend to one of its own. But it required collective courage and a community solidarity that could not always be counted on, particularly when the Lord had the power to fine the whole jury for a perverse verdict. The royal common law courts are theoretically available to you for more serious matters, but accessing them involves complications that make them functionally inaccessible to most peasants in most circumstances. The king's courts sit in fixed locations, Westminster primarily, with itinerant justices traveling circuits through the counties, and reaching them requires travel, time away from the land, money for fees and lawyers, and a level of legal sophistication that most peasants do not possess. Writs, the formal documents by which royal court proceedings are initiated, cost money to obtain. Legal representation, while not always required, is enormously helpful and also costs money. The machinery of royal justice is real and becoming increasingly sophisticated through the 12th and 13th centuries, but it is calibrated for the free, the propertied, and the literate. Moreover, there is a fundamental obstacle that stands between you and the royal courts for most purposes: your status as a villain. Royal common law in medieval England distinguishes sharply between free men and villains are largely excluded from using the royal courts to bring cases against their lords. This is not a minor technical limitation. It means that the person most likely to harm you, your lord, who has direct physical and economic power over you, is precisely the person you cannot sue in the most powerful court available. You can bring actions against other free men in royal courts. You can, in some circumstances, use royal courts to defend yourself against accusations. But the fundamental asymmetry of the legal relationship between lord and villain is written into the jurisdictional structure of the court system itself, and it does not favor you. The most dramatic and revealing aspect of medieval legal procedure is the range of methods used to determine guilt or truth in disputed cases, because these methods illuminate the underlying assumptions of a legal culture operating without forensic science, reliable documentation, or a developed theory of evidence. The oldest method, and the one that persists in various forms throughout the medieval period, is compurgation, also called oath-helping. In compurgation, the accused swears an oath of innocence, and then produces a number of oath-helpers, typically 12, in a number that will look familiar, who swear that they believe the accused oath to be true. This is not testimony about the facts. The oath-helpers are not witnesses in the modern sense. They are character witnesses and social guarantors, attesting not to what happened but to the trustworthiness of the person asserting what happened. The obvious problem with compurgation, from a fact-finding perspective, is that it measures social capital rather than truth. A person with 12 respected neighbors willing to swear for them will prevail regardless of what they actually did. A person who is unpopular or an outsider, or has made enemies in the community, may be unable to find compurgators even if they are entirely innocent. The system is not trying to find what happened. It is trying to resolve a dispute through a procedure that the community recognizes as legitimate, and legitimacy in this context is defined by proper performance of the ritual rather than by correspondence with external reality. Historians still argue about how medieval people actually understood compurgation, whether they viewed it as a genuine truth-finding mechanism, a social settlement procedure, or something in between, and the answer probably varies by time, place, and individual. The ordeal is the other famous medieval legal procedure, and it is both more dramatic and more theologically coherent than it might initially appear. Trial by ordeal. Walking across hot iron, plunging the hand into boiling water, being thrown bound into cold water, is not random brutality. It is a formal invocation of divine judgment, a request that God reveal the truth through physical signs that human investigation cannot uncover. The theology is clear. God will protect the innocent and expose the guilty through the medium of the body. Burns that heal cleanly indicate innocence. Burns that fester indicate guilt. Floating indicates guilt because the pure water rejects the corrupt soul. Sinking indicates innocence. The ordeal was formally administered by the Church, which gave it its theological legitimacy and its ritual structure. When the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, the same council that mandated annual confession, prohibited clergy from participating in ordeals, the ordeal effectively collapsed as a legal institution almost overnight, because without clerical administration it had no theological validity. This is one of the more dramatic examples in legal history of an institution disappearing rapidly once its foundational assumptions were officially withdrawn. What replaced it in criminal cases was jury trial, 12 men rendering a verdict, which is where the number 12 in the jury system comes from, carried over from the compurgation tradition. The transition from ordeal to jury trial in the 13th century is a hinge point in Western legal history, and it happened, at least partly, because of a single council's decision about priestly participation in boiling water. Trial by combat is the third great medieval legal procedure, and the one that most captures the popular imagination, probably because it involves swords. Trial by battle held that God would grant victory to the party in the right, and it could be invoked in certain kinds of disputes, particularly accusations of serious crime and some land disputes, as an alternative to other procedures. The parties or their champions fighting on their behalf would meet in formal combat, and the loser either died or yielded. Champions, professional fighters who could be hired to fight on your behalf, were a recognized profession in medieval legal practice, which somewhat undermines the theological premise but makes the system considerably more survivable for elderly disputants. Here is the quirky detail that tends to make legal historians very happy. Trial by combat was never formally abolished in English law. It was suspended by statute in 1819 after a defendant in a murder case, upon being accused, actually demanded his right to trial by combat rather than jury trial, correctly pointed out that the law still technically permitted it, and backed the legal system into a corner sufficiently uncomfortable that Parliament abolished it the following year. The medieval legal procedure outlasted the medieval period by several centuries through sheer institutional inertia, dormant in the statute books until someone with nothing to lose decided to use it. The forest law deserves special attention because it represents one of the most naked exercises of raw power over peasant life in the medieval legal repertoire. The royal forests, which are not forests in the modern ecological sense, but legal designations covering substantial areas of countryside that might include villages, fields, and farmland as well as actual woodland, are subject to a separate legal jurisdiction designed entirely to protect the king's hunting. Within the forest, you cannot clear land without permission. You cannot graze animals in the woodland without payment. You cannot take wood beyond your specific entitlements. And most significantly, you cannot hunt. The deer, the boar, the hares. These are the king's animals, and taking them is a serious offense. The penalties for forest offenses evolved over the medieval period from the truly horrific. Blinding and castration were prescribed punishments for deer poaching under some early Norman arrangements, to the more practically manageable, primarily financial fines extracted through the forest courts. But the message is consistent throughout. The recreational pleasure of the king and his nobility is legally protected in a way that overrides the subsistence needs of the people living in and around the forest. A starving peasant who snares a rabbit in royal forest is a criminal. The king who maintains thousands of acres of hunting reserve while people go hungry in adjacent villages is exercising his legitimate rights. This is not presented as a contradiction in medieval legal thinking. It is the system operating as designed. The ecclesiastical courts, the church's own judicial system, handle a range of matters that a modern person would not expect to find in a religious institution's jurisdiction. Marriage and its validity, legitimacy of children, inheritance where it touches on spiritual matters, defamation, perjury, usury, sexual offenses, and of course anything involving clergy. All of these fall within canon law's reach. The ecclesiastical courts had one significant procedural advantage for defendants that the secular courts lacked: a more developed tradition of rational evidence-based procedure, derived from Roman law through canon law scholarship. They were also, for obvious reasons, significantly more sympathetic to ecclesiastical interests than to lay ones. Benefit of clergy: the right of anyone who could demonstrate clerical status to be tried in the more lenient ecclesiastical courts rather than secular courts, was a significant and heavily exploited legal protection throughout the medieval period. Demonstrating clerical status in practice often meant demonstrating literacy, reading a passage of Latin, typically from the Psalms, which meant that the benefit of clergy was effectively a literacy test, which meant that educated men of all kinds could claim it. The particular verse used for this test, Psalm 51:1, known as the neck verse because successfully reading it saved your neck, was so well known as a test that defendants facing capital charges memorized it even if they were otherwise illiterate. A workaround so widely practiced that it became effectively a literacy test that you could pass without being literate, which is a beautiful illustration of how legal systems generate their own circumventions. Your chance of navigating all of this successfully, the manorial court and the royal courts and the forest courts and the ecclesiastical courts, depends less on your innocence and more on your social connections, your financial resources, your reputation in the community, and your luck. The wealthy have lawyers. The nobility have influence. The church has its own courts. You have your oath and your neighbors and the slim reed of custom, and if the Lord wants your land or the reeve has a grudge or the forest warden saw something he didn't like, the odds are not particularly in your favor. Justice in your world is not blind. It is looking very carefully at who is standing in front of it and adjusting its expression accordingly. There are bad years, and then there are the years that end worlds. You have lived through bad years already. The thin harvest, the sick ox, the winter that went on 3 weeks too long and ate through the grain stores before the spring greens were ready. You have learned to calibrate your anxiety against the agricultural reality in the practiced, unconscious way of someone who has been reading weather and soil and animal behavior since childhood, who knows what a bad year looks like from February and has already begun the quiet mental arithmetic of how to stretch what's there through what's coming. Bad years are survivable. Bad years are, in a grim sense, normal. They are the texture of agricultural life at the subsistence margin, the background noise of an existence permanently balanced between enough and not enough. But there are forces moving through your world that are not bad years in that manageable, survivable sense. There are forces that arrive from outside the normal range of agricultural difficulty, from the atmosphere, from the bodies of rats and fleas, from the decisions of kings and the ambitions of armies, that do not merely make life harder but unmake the conditions of life entirely. These are the forces that your planning cannot anticipate, your labor cannot prevent, and your prayer can only partially address. Tonight, in this section of our long, slow journey through your world, we are going to look at three of them: plague, war, and the slow catastrophe of climate. Any one of them arriving alone would be devastating. In the 14th century, they arrived together in a sequence that reduces the population of Europe by somewhere between a third and a half within a generation. We placed you safely in the 12th century. Remember, which means you will not personally live through what's coming. But the structural vulnerabilities that make the 14th century so catastrophic are already present in your world, woven into the fabric of the system you inhabit, waiting for the conditions that will activate them. Let us begin with war, because war is the most immediately visible of these forces and the one whose effects you might encounter directly even in the relatively stable 12th century. Medieval warfare is not a distant abstract event that you read about in chronicles written by monks in comfortable abbeys, though it is also that. It is a physical phenomenon that moves across the landscape, consuming resources, destroying infrastructure, and killing people in ways that do not neatly distinguish between combatants and the peasant farmers who happen to be living in the path of an army's march. An army moving through your area is a catastrophe in slow motion. Medieval armies live off the land, they do not carry comprehensive supply trains, and the logistical systems that might support an army without plundering the surrounding countryside are not yet developed to the degree that would make restraint practical. Foraging parties, soldiers collecting food and fodder from the surrounding villages, are a standard feature of medieval military operations, and the distinction between foraging and looting is, from the perspective of the peasant whose grain has just been taken, not a meaningful one. Your stored grain disappears. Your livestock is driven off. Your cart is commandeered for army transport. The soldiers are not necessarily gratuitously cruel, though gratuitous cruelty certainly occurs, but they are hungry and they have the weapons and you do not, and the arithmetic of that situation resolves itself in a predictable direction. The more deliberate version of this is the chevauchée, the mounted raid strategy used extensively by English armies in France during the 100 Years' War, which is still in your future but whose tactical logic is already present in 12th century warfare. The chevauchée involves systematically destroying the agricultural infrastructure of enemy territory, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, demolishing mills, driving off the peasant population, with the dual purpose of denying resources to the enemy lord and demonstrating that he cannot protect his people, undermining his political authority through visible failure. It is a strategy that treats peasant agricultural communities as both the means and the ends of military pressure, and it is devastatingly effective at achieving its military objectives while being absolutely catastrophic for the people living in the affected areas. What happens to you and your family when an army is coming is a question with a limited range of answers. None of them good. You can flee into the woods, to a relative's village at a safer distance, to the nearest fortified town if one is accessible and willing to admit refugees. Fleeing means abandoning your house, your stored food, your livestock, your tools, everything that makes agricultural life possible, and hoping that what you return to is rebuildable. You can stay and try to hide your most valuable possessions, burying grain, driving animals deep into the woodland, concealing the good tools. Archaeological finds of medieval hoards, coins, valuables buried in pots and never recovered, are sometimes interpreted as the material evidence of people who hid things before a danger that turned out to be unsurvivable. You can try to negotiate or pay tribute, which works if the army's commanders are in a mood to accept it and fails if they are not. Or you can simply be in the wrong place at the wrong time, which is the most statistically common outcome of an encounter between peasants and armies in the medieval period. The less dramatic but equally damaging effect of war on peasant life is fiscal. War is expensive, and the expense cascades downward through the social system in the form of taxation. Royal taxation for military purposes, aids, tallages, levies of various kinds, lands on communities that are already at the margin of their productive capacity. A bad harvest year plus a royal war tax is an equation with no good solution. Monasteries and wealthy landowners have reserves. You do not. What you have is what this year produced minus what you already owe, and when the royal tax demand arrives on top of all the other claims on that remainder, the thing that gives way is your family's food security. The Black Death arrives in England in 1348, and it is the most significant demographic event in English history before the 20th century. We need to talk about it even though it is technically outside your personal timeline, because it is the ultimate expression of the vulnerabilities we have been cataloging all night, and because understanding what the plague did to medieval society is essential to understanding why the world you inhabit is the way it is, and why, after 1350, it begins to change in ways that your grandchildren will experience as something approaching liberation. The disease that arrives in 1348 is Yersinia pestis, bubonic plague in its primary form moving through flea bites, and pneumonic plague in its respiratory form moving through the air. It kills with a speed and thoroughness that contemporaries found genuinely apocalyptic, because nothing in living memory, nothing in recorded history, had moved through a population at this rate. Estimates of mortality in the first outbreak, between 1348 and 1351, range from 30 to 60% of the English population, with the uncertainty in those figures reflecting genuine scholarly disagreement about how to interpret incomplete and unevenly distributed records rather than any shortage of evidence that the death toll was catastrophic. The symptoms of bubonic plague: the swelling of the lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, and neck into the painful masses called buboes, accompanied by fever, vomiting, and in hemorrhagic cases the skin discoloration that gave the retrospective name Black Death, typically killed within 3 to 5 days of onset. The pneumonic form, which spread directly between people through respiratory droplets, was faster and almost universally fatal. In villages where the disease arrived, it moved through the close-knit, physically proximate community with terrible efficiency. The sick and the dead were everywhere simultaneously, and the healthy were tending the sick and burying the dead and then becoming sick themselves before the burial was completed. Here is the quirky and somewhat haunting detail about the Black Death that tends to stop people when they encounter it: the mass graves of plague victims, excavated by archaeologists in the 20th and 21st centuries, often show evidence of careful, respectful burial even under conditions of overwhelming mortality. Bodies were laid out in rows, properly oriented, in ways that suggest surviving community members were maintaining burial customs and religious rites even as the dead accumulated faster than they could reasonably be processed. The impulse to bury the dead properly, to give them the ritual acknowledgement that medieval religious culture insisted they were owed, persisted through conditions that might reasonably have overwhelmed it. Historians still argue about the extent to which the Black Death disrupted social and religious cohesion in the immediate term versus the extent to which communities maintained their structures even in extremis, and the burial evidence suggests more continuity than the most apocalyptic contemporary accounts might imply. What the Black Death did to the survivors is, in some ways, as significant as what it did to the dead. The sudden, violent reduction of the labor force by a third to a half fundamentally altered the economic relationship between lords and peasants in ways that the manorial system could not simply absorb and continue. Land that had been fully cultivated was now lying fallow because there was no one to work it. Lords who had previously had their pick of tenants desperate to hold any strip of land now found themselves competing for the labor of a dramatically reduced peasant population that had, for the first time in generations, some actual bargaining power. Wages for agricultural labor rose sharply in the years after the plague, because the basic economics of supply and demand operated even in the 14th century, and the supply of labor had dropped catastrophically while the demand for it had not. The ruling classes attempted to reverse this through legislation. The Statute of Laborers of 1351 tried to fix wages at pre-plague levels and prevent peasants from moving to take advantage of better offers, and this attempt to use law to override economics produced resentment, evasion, and ultimately contributed to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, in which the accumulated grievances of a century found sudden, explosive expression in a movement that marched on London, murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury, and terrified the ruling class in ways that the chronicles of the period record with a vividness that speaks to genuine shock. The revolt was suppressed, as revolts of this period typically were, but the underlying economic changes that powered it were not reversible by suppression, and the following century saw the gradual erosion of villeinage as an institution and the slow, uneven emergence of something closer to a free peasantry. Climate, The third great force of this section operates more slowly than plague or war, but with equal ultimate effect. The medieval warm period, a phase of relatively mild, stable climate that prevailed across northern Europe roughly from the 10th to the 13th centuries, is the atmospheric foundation of the agricultural expansion that fills the high medieval period with its relative prosperity. Its growing population, its new villages and cleared forests and brought into cultivation marginal lands. More warmth means longer growing seasons. Longer growing seasons mean more grain. More grain means more people, more villages, more of the world we have been describing tonight in its various dimensions of difficulty. But more people, sustained by a climate that is favorable for a few centuries, means that the population has grown to a level that is supported by good conditions and dangerously exposed to bad ones. By the late 13th century, the population of England had grown to a level that historians estimate was not reached again until the 16th or 17th century. The land under cultivation had expanded to include marginal soils, thin upland soils, heavy clay lowlands, areas that only make agricultural sense when the climate is cooperating fully. When the climate stops cooperating, the marginal lands fail first and hardest. The Little Ice Age, a prolonged period of cooling and climatic instability that began in the late 13th century and intensified through the 14th, is the atmospheric context for the Great Famine we mentioned earlier and for a broader pattern of agricultural difficulty that persisted for generations. Summers became shorter, wetter, less reliable. The growing season contracted. Crops that had been viable in the warm centuries became marginal or impossible. Storms became more severe, flooding coastal and low-lying agricultural land. The glaciers in alpine regions began advancing. The Norse settlements in Greenland, which had been viable in the warm period, became increasingly difficult to sustain and were eventually abandoned. For you, in your village, the climatic change is not experienced as a global phenomenon with a scientific name. It is experienced as a series of bad years that do not end, as harvests that fail in new and creative ways, as winters that arrive early and leave late, as the gradual, awful recognition that the margin you have been living on is narrowing, and that the strategies that got you through last year's difficulty may not be adequate for this year's. You do not know that the climate is changing in any systemic sense. You know that the weather is worse than your father said it used to be, and you think about what the priest said about God's judgment, and you try to figure out whether the south field might do better with barley this year instead of wheat, and you look at the sky. The sky looks back, impassive and enormous, and gives you nothing to work with. What these three forces, war, plague, and climate, have in common, beyond their immediate destructive capacity, is that they reveal and amplify the vulnerabilities already present in the system. The manorial economy works in its grinding, exploitative way when the conditions are stable. It has no resilience, no buffers, no mechanisms for absorbing catastrophic shocks. The peasant family living at the subsistence margin has no reserves to draw on when the harvest fails for the third consecutive year because the summer was too wet. The village community has no capacity to quarantine itself from a disease moving through the country because everyone is too interdependent, too physically proximate, too connected by the market and the road and the pilgrimage route to seal themselves off from the world moving through them. And so the world moves through them. And the world is sometimes the autumn light on a good harvest, and sometimes it is the sound of hooves on the road at night that means the army is closer than you thought, and sometimes it is the first fever in the household that everyone recognizes and no one can name, and you hold your children close in the dark of your one-room house, and the cattle breathe at the far end, and the thatch settles overhead, and you pray to the saints whose names you know by heart, and morning comes, and the field is still waiting. And yet, because this is the phrase that keeps surfacing when you sit with the full weight of everything we have walked through tonight, and you realize that the accounting is not quite complete. We have tallied the rent and the tithe and the Harriet and the week work. We have measured the backache and the bad teeth and the smoke in the lungs. We have counted the dead children and the failed harvests and the armies on the road and the plague moving through the village like a slow, terrible tide. We have been honest about all of it, as honest as the historical record allows, and the record is not flattering to the medieval world in any of its structural dimensions. But there is something missing from an account that is only darkness. And the thing that is missing is what kept people alive not just physically but inwardly. the texture of meaning and pleasure and connection that made a life worth living inside conditions that could easily have made it feel otherwise. Because people did find it worth living. This is not a sentimental reassurance tacked onto a grim account to soften the edges before you fall asleep. It is itself a historical fact, documented in the same records that document the tithes and the Harriets and the forest courts. Medieval peasants laughed. They fell in love. They made jokes that were, by the standards of any century, fairly ribald. They took fierce, specific, personal pride in things, the quality of their ale, the straightness of their furrows, the particular skill with which they could read the weather coming over the western hills. They had opinions about their neighbors that were complex and nuanced and occasionally extremely unfair, in the fully human way of opinions about people you've known your entire life. They experienced joy with a completeness that deprivation does not eliminate and may, in some ways that we struggle to articulate, have intensified. The festivals are where we should begin, because the festivals are the most visible and well-documented expression of medieval peasant joy, and because they are genuinely wonderful when you encounter them in the historical record in all their specificity. The liturgical calendar that we examined in Section 6 as a source of obligation and anxiety is also, from another angle, a calendar of celebration, a structure of recurring, anticipated pleasures that punctuated the working year with regular intervals of sanctioned revelry. The Church, which extracted so much from you in so many ways, also gave you Christmas and Easter and Midsummer and the feast days of dozens of saints, and on those days the normal rules of work and sobriety and social deference were, within limits, suspended. Christmas was not a single day but a 12-day feast running from December 25th through Epiphany on January 6th, and in the depths of a northern European winter, when the agricultural work was at its lowest ebb and the days were short and the cold was constant, these 12 days were a genuine reprieve. Feasting on whatever had been preserved and saved for the occasion, the best ale, the fatted pig slaughtered at Martmas in November, the cheese that had been aging since summer, visiting neighbors, singing, games and dancing, a temporary softening of the hierarchical rules. Lords sometimes hosted their tenants at Christmas feasts, a ritual inversion of the usual relationship that was partly genuine generosity and partly political theater, demonstrating that the Lord who took so much could also give, that the relationship was not only extraction but had something of mutual obligation in it. May Day and Midsummer were the great summer festivals, and they had a vitality and a physicality that medieval church authorities regarded with consistent suspicion and medieval peasants embraced with consistent enthusiasm. The erection of the maypole, a tall pole decorated with flowers and ribbons, danced around by the village community, is the most famous survival of these celebrations, but it was surrounded by a whole season of flower gathering, greenery bringing, outdoor dancing, and a general loosening of social constraint that the surviving church condemnations describe with enough scandalized specificity that you can reconstruct the fun with reasonable accuracy. Young people went into the woods at night to gather mayflowers and came back in the morning looking cheerful and somewhat disheveled, and the church wrote disapprovingly about this practice in terms that tell you everything you need to know about what was actually happening in the woods. Harvest Home, the communal feast celebrating the completion of the harvest, was perhaps the most emotionally charged of all the agricultural celebrations, because it followed directly on the most exhausting and highest stakes labor of the year. When the last sheaf was cut and brought in, when the grain was safely stored and the anxiety of those 3 desperate weeks in August and September was finally resolved into relief, the whole community came together in a celebration that had earned its name. Food and ale flowed more freely than at any other time of year. There was music, the fiddle and the pipe and the drum, and dancing that went on past dark, past exhaustion, into the category of things that happen when people who have been working at the absolute limit of their physical capacity suddenly have nothing left that they are required to do. The emotional release of Harvest Home, in a community that has spent weeks not quite knowing whether they would survive the winter, was not decorative. It was essential. The alehouse deserves its own moment here, because it is one of the most important and most consistently underestimated social institutions in medieval village life. The alehouse, typically a private home where ale is brewed and sold, often operated by a woman, the alewife who hung a bunch of greenery or an ale stake outside her door to signal that fresh ale was available, is where the village gathers when it is not gathered in the field or the church. It is where news is exchanged, where disputes are aired before they escalate to the manorial court, where deals are negotiated. where someone plays a tune and someone else starts singing, and before long the whole room has joined in. It is warm when your house is cold. It is noisy when your house is silent with worry. It is full of people who know you and your family and your history and your failings and forgive them, mostly, because they have their own. The games played in a medieval village are worth cataloging briefly, because they reveal something important about the people playing them. Football, a game that bore approximately the relationship to modern soccer that a bar fight bears to a ballet, was played between villages with teams of unlimited size, rules of minimal specificity, and a ball that might travel several miles between the nominal goals before the game concluded. It was loud, muddy, physically brutal, and enormously popular, which tells you something about the appetite for physicality in people whose daily lives were already physically demanding, that rather than resting, they chose to chase a pig's bladder across several parishes with their neighbors. Wrestling was another favored activity, with local champions acquiring community status that persisted long after the match. Archery was both sport and military preparation. English archery practice was mandated by royal statute for exactly this dual reason, and the village archery butts were a regular gathering point. The oral culture of your village is rich in ways that do not survive well into the historical record precisely because it is oral. It lives in mouths and ears rather than on parchment, and when the mouths are gone the stories go with them. What we can reconstruct from the edges, from the stories that eventually did get written down, from the songs that were transcribed by collectors, from the passing references in clerical condemnations and court records, suggests a narrative culture of considerable vitality. Fairy tales and folk legends, local ghost stories, ballads telling of outlaws and lovers and miraculous events, riddles, proverbs, jokes. The humor of medieval peasants, when it surfaces in the record, tends toward the earthy and the irreverent in ways that remind you, pleasantly, that human beings have been finding the same things funny for a very long time. The landscape itself was a source of meaning that we risk overlooking if we stay too focused on the economic and institutional dimensions of medieval rural life. The fields you work are not just productive units to you, they have names, histories, personalities almost. The great elm at the corner of the south field was there when your grandfather was young. The spring in the lower meadow has a patron saint and a particular reputation for healing eye trouble, and you have seen people come from 3 villages away to wash their eyes in it, and you do not think this is remarkable because it is simply a fact about the world you live in. The landscape is inhabited by meaning in a way that the modern disenchanted world struggles to fully imagine. Not supernatural in a frightening sense, but animate, significant, attentive to human action in ways that make the act of farming feel like a relationship rather than a transaction. Your neighbors are, finally, the thing that makes this life livable in the most practical sense. The community of the medieval village is not the idyllic, conflict-free collective of romantic imagination. We have established that your neighbors will testify against you in the manorial court and may not always be forthcoming with their compurgation oath when you need it. People in small communities know each other too well for idealization, and knowing someone too well has always included knowing the ways they are irritating and selfish and occasionally dishonest. But the same closeness that enables pettiness also enables genuine mutual support in ways that the isolated modern individual, however well-resourced, cannot easily replicate. When your ox dies, your neighbor lends you his. When your wife is in labor, the women of the village are there. When the harvest needs to come in before the storm, everyone is in the field without being asked. When someone dies, the village mourns together, and the mourning is real and communal and held in a shared framework of meaning that makes grief, if not easier, then at least not solitary. Historians still argue about the nature of medieval peasant community, whether the apparent solidarity was genuine cooperation or enforced interdependence, whether people actually liked their neighbors or merely needed them, whether the communal festivals expressed real joy or ritualized obligation. The honest answer is almost certainly both, in proportions that varied by individual and moment, which is also true of every human community that has ever existed. The fact that you need your neighbor does not prevent you from loving them. The fact that the festival is an annual obligation does not prevent it from being genuinely fun. Human beings are complicated in this way, capable of inhabiting multiple emotional registers simultaneously, and medieval peasants were fully human in exactly this sense. There is something else worth naming before we ease toward the end of tonight's journey. Something that sits underneath all of the specific pleasures and communities and festivals we have been describing. It is the quality of presence, of being fully, physically located in a particular place and time, without the layering of mediation and distraction that characterizes modern experience. You do not have a screen. You do not have an inbox. You are not simultaneously in this conversation and 17 others. When you sit by the fire in the evening, you are by the fire. When you eat, you taste what you are eating. When you listen to the fiddle at harvest home, the music is all there is. There is a kind of attention available in your life that the modern world has made structurally difficult, and while this is absolutely not an argument that medieval peasant life was better, it was not better by almost every measurable dimension, it does suggest that the texture of experience, moment to moment, may have had qualities of immediacy and wholeness that are not nothing. The children falling asleep in the corner of the alehouse while the adults talk. The first warm day of spring after a hard winter, when you take your boots off and feel the mud between your toes, and it is, unexpectedly, wonderful. The moment in late August when you cut the first sheaf and it comes away cleanly and the smell of the cut grain rises and you know, in your body before your mind has caught up, that it is going to be all right this year. The way your neighbor's laugh carries across 3 strips in the summer evening, and you laugh too without knowing what was funny, because laughter is contagious in every century. The particular gold of the light on the stubble field after harvest, the geese moving across it, the year settling toward its close. These are small things. They are not compensation for the rent and the tithe and the bad teeth and the smoke in your lungs. They are not an argument that suffering is acceptable or that injustice is bearable. They are simply what was there alongside everything else that was there, in the days of a life that was genuinely hard and genuinely lived. You have walked a long way tonight, through mud and smoke and cold and law and plague and liturgy and laughter. Your back hurts, as it always does. The fire is low. The children are asleep. And outside, the field stretches away in the dark, patient and enormous and indifferent, waiting for morning the way it always waits, the way it waited for your father and will wait for your children. And the stars above it are the same stars that have always been there, the same stars that are above you right now, wherever you are listening from, whatever time it is. And now, as we come to the end of tonight's long journey, it is time to set the medieval world down gently. Let it recede the way a landscape recedes when you travel away from it, still visible for a while, then smaller, then folded into the distance. The mud and the smoke and the cold are fading now. The bell that marked the canonical hours has stopped ringing. The reeve is not coming tomorrow. The field can wait. You are here. You are warm. Whatever is waiting for you in the morning, the inbox, the commute, the meeting that could have been an email, none of it requires the endurance that your medieval self brought to every single day as a basic survival requirement. Your bed, the one you are lying in right now, is softer than anything the peasant in our story ever felt beneath them. You breathe clean air, or something considerably closer to it than the wood smoke interior of a medieval longhouse. If your tooth hurts, there is someone trained and equipped to address it in ways that do not involve astrology. Let that gratitude be the last thing you carry with you into sleep tonight. Not a heavy gratitude that demands anything of you, but a soft one. A quiet recognition that the long chain of human difficulty and endurance and occasional, hard-won joy that stretches back through the centuries is part of what you are made of. Those tired, muddy, stubborn, laughing people are your ancestors in the broadest sense. Not necessarily by blood, but by the long, unbroken thread of human life on this particular planet, passing the world forward through the dark. The fire is out now. The village is quiet. The stars are out over the stubble field. Sleep well.